The Entrepreneur's Library, episode 125.
Welcome to the Entrepreneur's Library, the only book-centric podcast that reviews all the top-selling business books and shares authors' perspective firsthand. This is your resource to finding the next great book that will enable you to grow personally and professionally. Welcome your host, Wade Danielson.
Welcome back to the EL. Today we have Steven Krupp, co-author of Winning the Long Game: How Strategic Leaders Shape the Future. And like I said, Steve is co-author along with Paul J.H. Shoemaker. Welcome, Steve, and thank you for joining us on the Entrepreneur's Library.
Hey, thank you. Great to be here.
Before we take a deep dive into your book, will you take just a moment to introduce yourself? Tell us just a little bit about you personally.
Sure. So, Steve Krupp, I am currently the CEO of Decision Strategies International, which I've been doing for the past 4.5 years. But from a background point of view, I professionally am an organizational psychologist and did a lot of work throughout my career helping organizations become more effective, teams become more effective, and particularly recently helping leaders become more strategic and adaptive in a very volatile world that we live in. I have a wife, 3 kids, a number of animals, and enjoy getting out and about, walking around and riding my bike and doing things that are physical.
Excellent. So first of all, thank you for sharing that. And now let's jump right into your book, Winning the Long Game, which was just made available not that long ago, a couple of days actually. December 2nd, 2014 is when the book became available. And Steve, we're going to move quickly, but we're here to cover the top questions that our listener/reader would like to get answered. And the first one is, what was the inspiration behind writing Winning the Long Game?
Well, there are a couple of sources of inspiration. The first one was really the former work I was doing about 4 or 5 years ago. I was doing a lot of work with boards on CEO and top executive succession and what does the leader of the future look like? What's the profile? And the issue that came up over and over again was leaders are going to need to be more strategic. In this fast-changing, dynamic world, we need leaders who are more strategic. However, having heard that over and over again, what I also learned, and another source of inspiration, was very few people had much of a definition of what do you mean by strategic. They didn't have a clear guideline of what that is, how to define it, how to assess it, and how to develop it. So the lack of definition and clarity around building this capability, combined with the great need that we heard in the marketplace, really those were the sources of inspiration for why we thought we could write a book and build a framework to close that gap.
So I think you started to cover this a little bit, but I want to ask anyway, and that's what makes your book different from others regarding the same or similar topic?
Well, I think what makes it different is that we are really looking at the intersection of strategy and leadership. There's countless books on strategy and quite a few on leadership. Very few that really look at that intersection. How does a leader develop strategies, and how is a leader more strategic in this environment? And so that's one way I think it's distinct. The other is we've taken this fuzzy idea of strategic leadership and strategic thinking, and we've turned it into very concrete, tangible behaviors. And then we give very specific tools, techniques, actions that leaders can take to become more strategic. And lastly, based on research with about 30,000 leaders around the world, we've identified these 6 disciplines of being strategic, and we look at strategic leadership as a system of leadership behaviors, not one or the other, but these behaviors and these disciplines that need to be used in a systemic way as a holistic set of tools and leadership strategies that anyone can use to be strategic. And that would be the last thing I would mention, is that there's this notion of you sort of have to have some special attributes or be born with a strategic mind. We believe anyone can learn to be strategic, and there's very practical ways to begin to act more strategically.
So Steve, how would you suggest the reader engage with your book? Is this one that they can jump in and jump out, grabbing information as they need it, or was it really designed to be read from front to back?
I think it can work front to back, or you can jump in and out as I often myself do. The reason why I think it ideally should be read front to back is we have this system that builds over the course of the book. But once you've sort of got that idea and you're struggling with one particular discipline, let's just call it anticipate or learn, you can dive right in to get a deeper look at what are the issues and behaviors associated with each aspect. And so that's also very accessible. Or sometimes people just look at the questions that we frame or the practical ideas that we propose. One of the things that's interesting about the book is we start with a story about a fictitious character named Jane. And Jane is in the middle of a performance review. So she could be any leader. And actually, Jane has gotten a lot of very positive feedback in the first half of her performance review because she's told she's done a great job of cutting costs, of becoming more efficient, of streamlining the operation, and of executing on the business plan. But then the interview takes a strange turn, and Jane learns that she's also got some problems. She's some issues, and her boss says, "You're not strategic enough. You need to become more strategic. We're losing market share. Competitors are encroaching on our space. And Jane, you just need to be more strategic." So she writes it down, underlines it, and she says, "Well, what do you mean? What should I do to be more strategic?" And the boss says, "Well, you know Wayne Gretzky? Just skate to where the puck is going." And Jane doesn't have any idea who that is totally perplexed. And so the premise of the book is, how can Jane become more strategic? And one of the organizing principles in the book is we have this opening story about Jane. At the end of each chapter, we come back to, well, what would Jane take out of this? What would Jane do? And then in the last chapter is helping Jane build an action plan. So there is a holistic story and theme that runs through the book. But the opening chapter really begins with, after Jane, the fact that in this, we refer to this world as the VUCA world, which is it's volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And in this VUCA world, leaders must be more nimble, more strategic, more forward-looking, have more of an outside-in framework. And we illustrate a few leaders in the opening chapter who do this well and some who do this poorly. But we then introduce our roadmap. And the roadmap are these 6 disciplines, which I'll mention briefly, and then we'll build those out. Anticipate, which is really how do you see what's happening sooner than others. Challenge, how do you challenge the assumptions of your team, your industry, your business. Interpret, how do you make sense of complex data. Decide, how do you look at options and make tough decisions. Align, how do you engage your stakeholders and deal with differences. And learn, which is how do you experiment and keep trying things which you need to do in order to navigate a very fast-changing world. And then it all wraps around the end around what we call envision, which is how do you build a vision based on these capabilities. So the book is, after the opening chapter, the intro, the book is organized around those disciplines, and those are the next 7 chapters, and they all follow. So I'll just give you a quick taste of each one. So anticipate, again, this is about being able to see sooner and scan wider. And we actually refer to this chapter as elephants and black swans because, the notion is we're concerned about the black swans that may come out of left field. And our view is there's often lots of information you could be gleaning, elephants in the room, so to speak, that people aren't actually paying attention to. So how do you look for trends, look for changes, look for forces, look for uncertainties, and be prepared for those? We actually start this chapter and every chapter with a story about a leader who's particularly good at this. In this case, we talk about Elon Musk, who started PayPal and invented, was part of inventing a new way of doing online payments. And then most recently, many of you may have heard about Tesla, but he had this vision and he could see that there was a chance for an electric car to be successful if it was fast, if it was attractive, if it was sort of a sexy car, as stylish and speedy. And he's had remarkable success with this. He also scanned wider in looking at Apple to design Apple's designer to design his Tesla showrooms. And in bypassing the whole dealer distribution system and then coming up with a whole mechanism to develop batteries as part of the whole value chain for his car. So he's done things quite differently. We talk about leaders who haven't anticipated as well also. And so stories like what's happened to BlackBerry or Kodak or Blockbuster come to life in that chapter as well. The next chapter and the next discipline that we hone in on is challenge. And I think a lot of you will find this one fascinating because we start with an unlikely leader for a business book, which is Pope Francis. Now, Pope Francis has been getting a lot of attention lately, but if you think about what he's done, he's practiced these two components that we think are the essence of the challenge discipline. He's opened the window to let in fresh thinking, fresh ideas, fresh points of view. And he's also looked in the mirror and said, what we're doing or what we've been doing, may be out of touch. It may be out of date. And again, I think there's a lot of visibility around the Pope, but he's the first non-European Pope, so he can have this outsider perspective. When he was in Brazil on a trip, he got out of the car and walked with the people. He took a papal selfie. He's inviting Patti Smith to come and do a concert at the Vatican. At the same time, he's taking a hard look at the Vatican Bank and saying, we can't afford to have a corrupt bank. He's challenging some of the abuses that have existed in the church. And he has, fundamentally said, who am I to judge, certain people's personal preferences and choices? The other extreme of challenge is Fukushima, where there was a lot of data available that the Japanese nuclear plant wasn't as prepared for certain kinds of events, but they sort of didn't really take it seriously. They weren't interested in outside studies and research, and they kind of kept their heads down and just sort of didn't really deal with the issue. So that's the second discipline and second chapter, challenge. The third discipline is interpret, and that's about amplifying signals and connecting dots between them. We actually open this chapter with a little anecdote from Sherlock Holmes, and in case any of you have seen this, the movie is called The 7% Solution. It's about a fictional encounter between Holmes and Sigmund Freud. But the exciting, interesting thing is Holmes meets Freud and has no idea who he is, but just based on clues he sees in the environment, he's able to almost put a quick little history about who Sigmund Freud is. And the point was it highlights his capacities of looking at data and making sense of it. The real world example we use is actually the CEO of DuPont and the former CEO of DuPont, Charles Holliday, and how he was able to head off and help DuPont head off falling into the financial crisis way before most of the other businesses, because he noticed different things that were happening. Japanese customers trying to preserve cash, corporate lawyers trying to settle disputes, automakers trying to drag their heels. And he put these dots together and he said, there's something happening here and I better find out what it is. And in the course of doing that, his team realized that they were heading towards a financial meltdown, and they did the things that they needed to protect the business, avoid that kind of tragic possibility. The next discipline that we get into is decide. And again, some of you may remember some years ago, the Chilean mining disaster. But this was a situation where I think 33 miners were trapped underground, and there was a relatively new minister of mining. His name was Laurence Golborne, and he got thrown into this situation. And he practiced the two things that we think are critical for deciding. One is exploring your options, making sure you don't rush into a decision, that you really look at a lot of different options. And two, having the courage to make tough choices. So the first tough choice he made was to say, you know what? I'm coming to the scene. I'll take accountability. I'll form a team to work on this. I don't know a lot about the technical issues, but I'll engage the right people and facilitate, us thinking through these opportunities to save these miners. But then what he did, which was really particularly important here, was he explored a lot of options. a lot of different paths and pursued several of them simultaneously. And again, we talk a lot about optionality, and that optionality allowed them to ultimately save those miners and use several of the different plans as part of the rescue. Another story that's, those of you who are entrepreneurs will relate to, I think, in Decide is Reed Hastings of Netflix. Again, remember a few years ago, he failed to look at options when he was looking at going to streaming video and breaking off Netflix into two different entities, one streaming video and one traditional, DVDs. And each one might have been cheaper, but if you wanted both of them, it actually was a lot more expensive. And customers revolted. The stock price tumbled. Customers abandoned them. I think 80,000 customers left. But he had the courage then to recognize he had screwed up. He had made a mistake, and that he needed to do something about it. So he actually publicly apologized and was able to kind of stem the tide, right the ship, and ultimately position Netflix for their next phase of growth, which is happening now, where they started developing their own content. But the issue of having the courage to step into a situation was what he did well. Not exploring options was where he almost, caused the Netflix to go out of business back then. The fifth discipline in the next chapter is align, and that's really about how do you rally people together? You've made a decision, you've set a course. How do you rally stakeholders together so that they're really on board with you? And then, as important, how do you bridge differences? Because inevitably, there will be misalignment. There will be competing issues. And how do you bridge those differences? We use Whole Foods as an interesting example of a company that really believes in all stakeholders being interconnected, be those shareholders, be those employees, be those customers. And we show how they and John Mackey create this system of interconnected stakeholders where everybody shares a common vision and purpose, and they all are benefiting mutually when aligned around this common direction. And customers become employees are often shareholders, etc. And even their suppliers have to buy in to the Whole Foods strategy and vision, and then they get a preferred relationship with the company. They also get teams to be fully autonomous and responsible for their own area, be it fruits or vegetables. And that degree of making decisions about promotion or product or even who's on the team creates a high degree of alignment in the Whole Food stores. Kodak is an example where the alignment wasn't there. And even though some people realized they had to change because digital photography had taken over and iPhones had taken over, but they couldn't get the bulk of the organization to really get aligned around this transformation. And they unfortunately fell short. The sixth chapter, which is the last of these disciplines, is called Learn. And that's about experimenting and trying things and then diving deep to learn from those. And Sarah Blakely, who was the founder of Spanx, is the poster child for this particular chapter because she had a lot of challenges in her life. She failed at many things, including the lower boards and including several different jobs. And ultimately, going for a job interview, she didn't like the way she looked. She started messing around with her pantyhose, and she invented Spanx, and then became the youngest self-made female billionaire, actually until recently, through inventing Spanx and then figuring out how to market it just by trying a lot of different things, being non-conventional, and learning as she went. So the sixth chapter is around this idea of experimenting and then learning from what you do. And one of the tips and techniques we introduce in this chapter, and we have them in all the chapters, is doing an after-action review, trying things, and then really carefully analyzing what worked, and if it didn't work, why not, and what can we learn from it. It's the Procter & Gamble motto, fail fast, fail cheap, and fail often. Well, really, Google has sort of perfected this by doing all kinds of experiments, little ones and big ones in their Google X Factory. But from all of those, understanding that only a few of them will work, but what do we learn from the mistakes, and what can we take from those through a disciplined after-action kind of review. Now, again, as I said earlier, at the end of each of these chapters, we come back to Jane and we look at, well, how would Jane react or think about these ideas relative to solving her problem and becoming more strategic in her setting? And then we also give very practical tips and tools and techniques that people can use to get better at any of these things, to get better at learning, to get better at deciding, etc. So let's say decide. The first tip is, always look at multiple options before making a decision. And interpret, a tip might be seek out, disconfirming evidence that maybe disputes your theory. In aligning, it's create a stakeholder map to understand all the stakeholders in your environment. In challenge, it's foster debate on your team, perhaps having a devil's advocate to help with the challenge. So that's the idea of very practical tips. I'll just mention briefly the last two chapters. One is we bring it all together around one very well-known leader, Nelson Mandela. And Mandela, we show how he applies all these 6 disciplines in his vision of transformation in South Africa. And of course, Mandela is a well-known story. But what we do is look at the leadership skills he did, the strategic approach he took to ultimately change the entire world, and certainly the way South Africa operated and to overcome apartheid. We also talk about another leader who's less well-known. That's Albert Barnes of the Barnes Foundation in Philadelphia, but we look at him through that same lens of strategic leadership. And then the last chapter is coming back to Jane, as I mentioned, and helping think about, well, what would be an action plan for Jane? And here we introduce our strategic aptitude assessment, and we show the scores that Jane would have had. And based on her scores, we design a very personalized action plan. And lastly, we come back to the reader and say, okay, think about your own strengths and weaknesses. You can ask yourself these same assessment questions, and then you can draw from the various tips and tools and ideas in the book to build your own action plan to become a more strategic leader. So that's kind of where we conclude the story of the book, having come full circle with Jane, and then finally back to you as the learner and the reader. What can you specifically do and take from this to apply tomorrow? And to your earlier question, you could see how it would be nice to read all the way through, but then you could say, but I'm struggling with the issue of making a decision. You could go right to that chapter and you could pick out some tips, some tools, read one of the stories which are inspirational about how people have made some very challenging decisions using these ideas in our framework.
No, that makes sense. I don't know why you said it that way. And Steve, you just went through a ton of really important content and context information. And this next question really is asking you to even break it down a step further. And if the reader could only take away one concept, principle, or action item out of your entire book, everything that you just took the time to discuss with us, what would you want that to be?
Well, I think the big takeaway for me is that everyone can be strategic, or at least more strategic. And that although it seems sometimes overwhelming to navigate this world that we're in, which is very uncertain and very dynamic and very confusing, we actually believe that there are very specific practical things one can do to become more strategic. So if there was one thing I hope people take away from this, it would be just that. There are tips and tools that we can all use to look out further, to challenge assumptions, to make more sense of the data around us, etc. That really each of us can apply every day.
So do you have a favorite quote from your book?
I do. I mean, there's a few quotes that I love, and each chapter starts with kind of a little bit of a quote. But my favorite one is in chapter 6 on Learn, and it's called, "My Gift Was Not Knowing." And this was Sarah Blakely, who was somehow freed by not knowing anything about the retail industry, to make phone calls, to reach out to people, to try things. She wasn't bound and constrained by having grown up in the industry. And I think the beauty of that and why I think it's so powerful is sometimes to bring about change, you really either have to be an outsider or you have to have the ability to look at things as an outsider. And the gift of not knowing is, you know what, I can try things, I can make mistakes because I don't know the rules, and therefore I'm not bound and constrained by them.
Excellent. So we'll put that on our show notes. I know a lot of people will like to mull over that later on. They might be driving right now, but
yeah.
My next question is, obviously authors design books to really help people create a paradigm shift or create change. And so what's a book that you can recommend to our listeners based on the way that it had a huge impact or even created a paradigm shift for you?
Well, in the course of obviously writing a book, one reads a lot of books. And of course, I've always done that anyway. But the book that I read actually since I wrote Winning the Long Game, since we wrote Winning the Long Game, is called Abundance. And Abundance, the future is better than you think. And why that book is so powerful is because it paints a very optimistic and look at what's happening now and what's happening and will happen in the future. The premise of the book is, we and I think we all experience this every day if we watch the news or look at what's going on. There's a lot of bad things happening in the world. And it seems like whether it's violence or poverty or healthcare issues are pervasive. Yet the facts actually are not that way. In fact, if you look at things around the world, things are getting better on all these fronts. And the main reason that's happening is because of the speed of technological change and how quickly we are innovating new technologies in energy, in healthcare, in education, etc. And so what I found and do find still very, very compelling and exciting about this book is it takes you back from the momentary shock that we get all the time from all the bad news, and it gives you a bigger picture perspective of actually we're making a lot of progress, and the speed of technology is going to accelerate that. And that we have a chance to solve some of these seemingly impossible problems. And I think the connection back to winning the long game is we do have to play a long game and not be distracted always by what the present is showing us. And I think strategic leaders tend to be optimistic and believe that they can find a way. They may not know yet how, but they'll figure it out. And so I think Abundance gives a lot of confidence and a lot of data and a lot of interesting examples of technology that's reshaping the world that I think can be motivating to any of us, but particularly to leaders, strategic leaders who are interested in winning the long game.
Excellent. Well, Steve, before we depart, can you recommend the best way for our listeners to not only get more information on you, but also your book, Winning the Long Game?
Yeah. Well, so it's available, through all the normal channels, Amazon, Barnes and Nobles, all the big stores. If you go to our website, www.decisionstrat, you will see that there's information. You can learn more about the book there, obviously learn more about myself. And, my information and bio is certainly on that website. And Decision Strategies International is the company, DSI. And we focus quite a bit on the issues that we cover in this book, helping leaders and companies become more strategic. My co-author is Paul Schumacher as well. He's the founder of DSI. And, he's also profiled on our website.
Excellent. Well, Steve, thank you so much for coming on and sharing your book with us.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening in today. If you'd like more information on Steve or his book, Winning the Long Game, check out the show notes at the elpodcast.com. And if you'd like the opportunity to win his book, Winning the Long Game, you can actually do that by becoming a VIP.
Looking for your next book idea?
Head over to the elpodcast.com,
where Wade shares his amazing resource, the top 10 business books recommended by over 500 entrepreneurs, with you for free.
That's the elpodcast.com.
Till the next time, keep it on the EL.